So as I said, my name is Dennis Cooley. I'm the director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute, and this is part of our public forum series this particular year, civic civility or having civil conversations. So civil conversations on controversial topics. Our speaker here today has had to do that many, many times. So she is an expert. You can ask her just about anything on this. Our Representative Karla Rose Hanson has served in the North Dakota House since 2016. Representing District 44, she has sponsored and passed legislation related to suicide prevention, improved access to diabetes healthcare, expanded healthcare for veterans, and criminal justice reforms that improve lives while saving money, which is a big thing in North Dakota. Hanson serves on the House Appropriations Committee, which writes the budget for North Dakota's higher education institutions. Hanson is a graduate of NDSU, and we're proud of her and that she's come back to help our community. And she works as a corporate communications professional outside of her legislative work. She lives in North Fargo with her husband, 2 sons, and several critters, which is kind of interesting what a critter is. But anyways, let's welcome our speaker.
So much. So one of the very first conversations I had in the North Dakota House Chamber after I was first elected in 2016 was with Representative Luke Simons. So as many of us do when we're introduced to someone new, we exchanged pleasantries. We talked about each other's families and each other's jobs. And after a few minutes of chatting, Representative Simons said to me, "You don't seem as evil as they say you are." Thank you. So today I'm here to share some thoughts with you on how to have civil conversations with other people who might have different views than you, especially on controversial topics. So my hope is to arm you with some ideas on ways that you can feel empowered to have these types of conversations about tough subjects, and maybe even feel inspired to actually go and do that. We'll get into the reasons why in a minute, but right off the bat, my first tip for you is don't start a conversation the way Representative Luke Simons did. So just to back up for a minute before we dive in, it is hard to discuss divisive topics. We're told from the very beginning of our lives, don't discuss politics at the dinner table, especially nowadays when we have such deep polarization about politics, very different views on things from war to vaccines to the election results and so on and so on. So it's also taboo around here to talk about sex and religion. Society and the media often will emphasize to us that people's views on these topics like abortion and gun control, these views are intractable. And so it means that we shouldn't even bother to even having conversations about these topics. We're not even gonna be able to change someone's mind on them. So when we're told that we shouldn't talk about these topics, then we don't develop the skills that we need on how to do it effectively. So today we'll just talk about some ideas on how we can have more civil conversations. These are certainly based on trial and error on my part over the last 8 years in the North Dakota legislature. During that time, I've worked with lawmakers and constituents with different ideologies than I have. And I've navigated conversations on topics ranging from reproductive freedom to gun violence prevention. So if you can advance the next slide, I don't know. Maybe you can.
Yes. Well, I'm noticing your microphone. If you could turn the top on the microphone, they can hear you. That will
oh my gosh.
A little bit better.
So sorry about that. Hopefully that's better. So first of all, how you start a conversation is critical. Dr. Peter Coleman, who leads the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia University, says, research shows that when you first enter into a conversation about important differences, the first things that you say and do matter the most. Our goal should be to establish a positive foundation with the other person. So certainly don't enter into the conversation with an attack or accusation, like you have the facts wrong. Those conversations are going to go nowhere. Also, don't make assumptions. Too often, we are quick to assume based on another person's party affiliation or their geography, where they live, or other factors, what they might believe. We're quick to assume what their morals or their beliefs or their values might be before actually having a conversation to confirm that. So going back to my story about Representative Simons, don't start a new relationship by calling a person a name or labeling them. I will note that Representative Simons was ultimately expelled from the North Dakota House, but for different inappropriate behavior. So, but also please do show respect to the other person with your words and with your tone and with your body language. Even just the perception of arrogance or stubbornness can really turn someone off and cause your conversation to get stuck. So really try to be self-aware of crossed arms or a furrowed brow or a tone that might come across as dismissive. Here's an example of what might be perceived as not showing respect. One afternoon in 2023, during that legislative session, one of the brand new legislators that year, Representative Nick Rios, came up to me while I was sitting at my desk in the North Dakota House chamber. I was wearing headphones and I was listening to a live committee hearing that was being live streamed through the computer. And this committee was about to take action on a bill that I sponsored. And so I was waiting for them to make a vote. And because I was introducing this bill, I was waiting to see what the outcome was. I was intently staring at the computer screen. Representative Rios walked up to me and he said something to me along the lines of, your speech during today's floor session must have broken a record with how long it was. Let me note that Representative Rios and I did not know each other at all. We had never even exchanged pleasantries like, hi, my name is Karla, and where are you from? What do you do for a living? So his comments were the very first words between us. I was taken aback because I really perceived his comment as criticism. So I said, well, why don't I come to your desk when I'm finished listening to this and we can talk some more. So a few minutes later, I walked up to Representative Rios's desk where he was sitting. And again, he told me that my speech was excessively long. I explained that the bill that I was speaking on was a large appropriation bill. And my job was to explain to the whole chamber why the committee was recommending that the chamber vote yes on this bill because it was including some very large investments. So there was some explaining to do. And I added that my speech was actually just 10 minutes and that he would certainly hear much longer floor speeches from bill carriers who are explaining bigger, more complex budget bills, such as the human services budget or the higher ed budget, for example. A way for him to have started our relationship in a more positive way would have been to, first of all, introduce himself and then ask with curiosity why my speech was longer than he anticipated. That type of positive start would have focused on initiating a relationship and showing curiosity rather than starting with what could be perceived as criticism. And this tip should be assumed, but unfortunately it's not always followed. But another tip is don't start off a relationship by yelling and screaming at someone. So in 2019, I introduced a bill that had the intention of reducing gun violence in North Dakota. It created a legal process called extreme risk protection orders in the court. People who were, let's say, enthusiastic about their gun rights would call my cell phone and start off the conversation by screaming at me, calling me a Nazi, other many types of names, and saying that the Second Amendment shall not be infringed. It didn't matter what I said. They just yelled louder that they had a God-given right to have their weapons. Needless to say, starting out the conversation in this way meant the conversations never went very far. So in the spirit of starting positive, I encourage you not to start with attacks, not to make assumptions about other people, and not to engage in name calling or labeling. accusations, and definitely not screaming and yelling. Research shows that it might be maybe not natural, but understandable if you were to engage in some of these behaviors. The sense of outrage that we often feel when we look at media reports or social media can literally trigger a physical response in people. It is instinctual for people to be suspicious of what they see as a potential threat to themselves, just because of our instincts for survival. But we are also hardwired to cooperate with each other. So when there is a conflict and you don't have that positive foundational relationship, then I might see you as the problem. You are the obstacle or the threat. But if we've started things out in a positive way and then we identify a conflict, then we have a problem. Maybe we can both own the problem. We can work together on how to solve it. It's a different mindset on how to navigate the situation when you have a positive start to your relationship. So tip number 2, if you want to advance the slides. That really leads me to my next tip. Get to know the person's story. Work to understand why they believe what they believe. This is easier if you follow tip number 1 and you've already established a positive rapport and a basic relationship, because there actually has to be some level of trust to be able to share your stories with each other. If you don't have some level of trust with each other, it's still possible to build a solution together. It just might be a little more difficult. Many people think that the answer to conflict resolution is compromise. If we can only master the art of compromise, how to best split the difference, then we can resolve these sticky issues. However, compromise is not always possible, nor is it maybe not always actually the best solution. If you've ever gone to a training on how to negotiate, you will often hear the example of the orange. So in this scenario, 2 people are fighting over a single orange. They both want that orange. The natural suggestion is to split the difference. Let's just cut the orange in half and you each get half the orange. But if you ask them why they want the orange, you might be able to come to a different solution. Maybe one person wants to eat the fruit of the orange, and the other person wants the rind or the peel of the orange to zest it to use for a recipe. So if you get to the why behind why they want it, perhaps they can both get 100% of what they want. They can either get the entire peel or the entire fruit. That's not a compromise. Instead, it's problem solving by understanding people's motivations. So taking the time to explore what's most important to the other party, not just assuming what's critical to them, can really help you problem solve together. So I encourage you to be curious and be open to learning. One way to do that is to ask questions of the other people. So you could say something like, this is what I've learned about this topic. What have you learned? And that type of questioning kind of creates an equal footing between the 2 of you. And it really emphasizes an approach of learning rather than winning. If people perceive you as trying to win the argument instead of collaborating together on the problem, moving together can be more difficult. So as you dive into each other's why, remember that different approaches to this resonate with different people. So I'm an analytical person. Data and facts, especially from reliable sources, really resonate with me. That is important to my decision-making process. But that's not the case for everyone. In fact, when we rationally justify our position on an issue with data and evidence, it can feel like an attack to other people. This approach could backfire on you and cause others to double down on their beliefs and really dig in their heels. So that's why stories could actually be even more powerful than data and evidence. Being open to learning about other people's stories can lead to better understanding. I have several of these examples in my work, both in the categories of what works and what doesn't. So first story is one time, this was several years ago, I was visiting with a lawmaker who was different from me in every respect. We lived in different parts of the state, urban versus rural, we're different genders, different parties, different ages. And he brought up the topic of a contentious abortion bill that we were about to vote on in the House chamber. He started the conversation by making an assumption. He said in a very dismissive tone, well, I already know your position on that. So I said, just wait a minute. Let me share a story with you about two of my friends who were in a situation that would have been affected by this very bill. I told him why these women who had wanted pregnancies considered abortion in their situations. I said, when a woman is pregnant, people come up to you, including strangers, and they touch your belly, and they ask you, and they squeal, and they say, what color is the baby's room going to be? What names are you considering? Do you know the sex of your baby? And if you have just learned that your baby has a fatal anomaly, those conversations are torture. So these women who had wanted pregnancies might have learned that their baby at maybe the 20-week ultrasound was going to die as soon as that baby was born. So at 20 weeks, they could have another 20 weeks, another 5 months of those types of conversations where people are asking them and they have to respond, actually, my baby's going to die. So the second example I want to share is an approach that didn't work so well. This story goes back to when, in 2019, when I wrote a bill to create extreme risk protection orders. It's a legal process to temporarily remove a weapon if someone is a danger to themselves or others. When I introduced this policy proposal, I emphasized facts and data. I talked about gun violence statistics in North Dakota. I talked about case law to prove why this policy was constitutional and did not conflict with the Second, Fourth, or Fifth Amendments of the US Constitution. But none of my facts and data mattered because gun ownership can be an emotional issue for many people. People associate their gun ownership with personal safety or with very fond memories of hunting with their family and their friends. So as I mentioned earlier, presenting information to someone to prove your point can backfire and cause people to dig in even more. I could have done better at navigating the emotions of the issue. I could have done better at understanding people's why. So the third tip I have is my last tip. Is everything okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Coleman, the research from Columbia University that I mentioned earlier, recommended this simple tip. Take a walk together. He says research shows that there's power in movement, particularly in movement together. Walking outside and walking side by side enables you to be more in sync, literally and figuratively. It is such a contrast from sitting across the table from one another where you can perceive each other as adversaries. Diplomats have used the tool of walking together for decades. So my last example for you is not as a legislator, but as a mother. Those of you who are parents might know this technique too, I suspect. So I have two boys, and when any one of my boys will accompany me when walking the dog, or go for a car ride together when we're both looking forward, not at each other, that can enable conversations that wouldn't otherwise happen. Both of my boys are a lot more comfortable sharing their worries or their dreams with me when we are walking or we are driving than when we are sitting across the table from each other in the dining room. Walking together might just encourage you and the person you are with to open up more and judge the person less. Walking together might spark a transformational moment or a breakthrough moment in your problem-solving efforts so that you can work together on a solution. So in closing, I'll refer to a perspective from Alexandra Hudson. She's the author of The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. She's on a mission to elevate public discourse. One of the things that she emphasizes is to distinguish between politeness and civility. These are terms we often use interchangeably, politeness and civility, but they're actually different. Politeness is about manners, our external behavior. Civility, on the other hand, can be something deeper and richer. Let me share a quote from this author, Hudson. Civility is the disposition of the heart. It's a way of showing others a bare minimum amount of respect just by our shared dignity and moral status of members of the human community. So thank you to the Northern Plains Ethics Institute for sponsoring this entire series on civil conversations. It is critical for us to learn how not just to have a conversation with people who have disagreements with us, but it's also critical to learn how we can flourish when we have competing visions of what is good. So I hope you come away from today's conversation thinking it is not only possible to have a civil dialogue with people who see things differently than you, but also that you feel inspired to and empowered to actually do so. So I know that's a short little talk, but I love it. I love having questions. So I'd love to just hear questions either from our online audience or people in the room. What questions do you have? What other ideas do you have for what's worked for you on having civil conversations?
So questions, Tyler will read the ones from online, but of course, you can take them in the room yourself as you go.
Yes, Patty.
I really enjoyed your stories about trying to work with different legislators, and I wondered if there's any form of training for legislators in emotional intelligence or just Dale Carnegie techniques or civility rules and training. Those are my two questions. Are there?
Yes. So the question for people who might not have heard is, do legislators have the benefit of any training, either on civility or rules, to help them navigate these kinds of conversations? And I would say no to the training on civility, things like this. There's certainly mentorship opportunities. I would say both parties in the North Dakota legislature try to match new legislators up with a more experienced legislator. And so hopefully there could be some one-on-one conversations about here's how to best shepherd your bill through the process. Here's some people you can talk to, here's some tips. There are rules. We have a rule book that creates a code of conduct, if you will. And again, that might be more behaviors, not necessarily as the author I quoted, the intention of the heart. So politics is a team sport. You only get things done when you work together. And so relationships are the foundation of that. And I would say a lot of people might look at the legislature and see a lot of conflict because that is what they read in the newspaper. Obviously the media will cover the things that are most contentious and controversial. Certainly those things exist. And those aren't fun. But there is a lot to our work that isn't contentious, that is actually voted on unanimously or very much with consensus. And there's a lot of very strong relationships, across parties and across chambers. It just isn't necessarily seen all the time, but you have to be intentional about it. You have to intentionally work at those relationships to build a solid foundation. So let's say, there's maybe not a lot of formal training on how to do that. There is some papers that we get that say, here are the rules, don't walk in front of this person when they're speaking, don't, stand here in this, moment of the session, that kind of things. But that's about all we get.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I agree. I like your stories. That just personalizes it. And something you just said with reference to civil conversations, I think a lot of what you do, probably the negative comes out, not the positive. exactly what you said. So what can we do to get more of the positive out in those conversations? Because there's always going to be in your work, there's always going to be some disagreement,
Yes.
but that shouldn't be what we're always hearing. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, so is your question more about between each other or in the broader
It could be in the
narrative?
broader- It could be in the broader.
Yeah, it's true, that one of the frustrating aspects of the 2023 legislative session was all the culture war bills, and believe me, there was a lot, there's way too many of them, got a lot of the headlines and a lot of the attention and sucked up all the oxygen in the room. Meanwhile, we were doing some really good work behind the scenes on K through 12, on higher education, on behavioral health, and a lot of other important issues, that matter to North Dakotans on an everyday basis. But that doesn't always, make the headlines. One thing I think is important, and maybe this is because in my day job, I am a communications professional, but I think communication is super important. It's an important skill for legislators to have, to communicate back to their constituents about what is happening. So one thing we do in our district as a team of 3 legislators is we send weekly emails during the legislative session. So every weekend we say, well, here's what happened this week on kind of the big ticket items. Because things change rapidly. It's even hard for legislators to keep up with what's happening, much less the public. And then on a monthly basis during the legislative session, we have forums. And so people can come to our public forums on a Saturday morning, get a little update from us, and then ask questions, just like what we're doing here today. And I think it's super important to communicate with people on what's going on so that they hear more than just what the headlines are saying. But that means 2 things. One, you have to have legislators who are willing to take the time to communicate out. And number 2, you have to have a public that's willing to be engaged in that process. And I would say, a lot of the public is disinterested. What was the turnout of our last election in North Dakota? It was maybe 62% of people even voted. I would say a lot of those people don't even know who their state legislators are. And they certainly wouldn't take the time to, write an email to their legislators or go to a public forum. So we need stronger engagement on both sides of that equation, I would say.
I don't have any questions or comments in the
So,
chat.
so I have one. It's all well and good to talk about positivity. But how do you deal with an issue which people are really good at reading other people's minds and how they react and so on. And from the different things, you really don't like that individual. And it's hard to try to make your body language work when, I don't know if you remember when I testified at
I do.
the other thing, and I had to run in with a particular thing, and we clearly did not like each other. We have not changed our opinion on that since.
Yeah, it is hard. So I remember sitting in, so for several sessions, I sat on the Judiciary Committee, which, deals with, a lot of contentious issues. And one of my colleagues on that committee was Representative Rick Becker, who has run for different offices. He was behind the property tax measure that was recently on the ballot. And he and I have, for the most part, very different views. Actually, sometimes one side and the other side come and then they end up meeting in the middle. The 2 extremes. But we enjoyed each other in the sense of we could spar, right? We could, we both could have a fun debate about different topics. So I think we had a level of respect for each other based on that. But one day he said to me, Karla, I can see every thought you have on your face. I can see exactly what you're thinking just by looking at your face. And I was like, Rick, I feel like I'm doing a super good job controlling that and like trying to be neutral, have the poker face, if you will. So if you're still seeing that, that means that on the inside, I'm looking like Kermit with waving his hands, and that's how crazy I'm feeling. It's because I feel like I've toned it down quite a bit on my facial expressions. But you're right. It's hard to fake, a genuine fondness for someone, and, then you just have to look for the common ground. I mean, there's opportunity to find common ground everywhere. An example of that I have is Senator Yana Murdahl. She's from actually kind of my hometown area up in the northeast part of North Dakota. She and I have very different views on issues like LGBT equality or reproductive freedom, very different views. But we have a shared passion for rural communities thriving. And, I grew up in that area, and I am still a small town girl at heart, and even though I live, in the most urban area in North Dakota now. So while we differ on some things, we have common ground in other areas. And during the last session, we co-sponsored a bill together on supporting rural grocery stores. Because if you don't have a grocery store in your small town, things will get tough fast. I mean, things will go downhill pretty fast. And, it's either your school or your grocery store, and then you don't have much of a main street, you don't have much of a community left. Who's going to want to move to a small town if you don't have, a school or a grocery store? So we felt strongly about helping support that element of our small towns. And so we worked together to make that happen, and it passed. And it's shown to be a good success. I hope we can continue working together on that topic. Now, again, going into the 2025 session, she's chairing the pro-life caucus, and I'm bringing forward a bill to protect, or two bills to protect contraception and IVF. And so again, very competing views of what's necessary in that arena, but hopefully we'll work together again on, phase 2 of the rural grocery store issue. So.
And I'd just like to follow up. I manage, I'm a supervisor of folks, and I tell individuals, focus on the task, not the personality. And now I have a better way of doing it. Focus on the task. Let's start off by saying, what are our values here?
Yeah.
And then if you find, I like that. That's a really good way of approaching it. So then the focus is not on personalities, but it's on those shared values. What do you need to get done? And that seems to work for you.
Absolutely. And another thing that I've read about, and I've read about this in the context of parenting and personal relationships, but it also works in these the context of professions as well, and lawmaking, is think about the bank that you have with a person, the bank of experiences you have, and the negative can outweigh the positive in perception, even though it is not outweighed in number. So for example, if you have 10 interactions with a person and 9 of them are positive and 1 is negative, that might be, I don't know I can't remember what the science is on the ratio, but you have a bank of positive interactions to rely on, and that will balance out maybe the 1 negative. Another example of how I've heard about this is, if you think of a piece of paper, there's a lot of white space. So let's pretend this is all positive right here. And then there's one little dot, and that represents the negative interaction. Where do you focus? You focus on the negative, focus on that little dot. And so if you have a bank with a person, this reservoir of good experiences, then hopefully it can balance out like maybe that one area where you're like not quite getting along. So.
I do have one online. It's about etiquette, decorum, and the legislator. The question is there an enforcement of behavior or civility rules surrounding those, or is it up to the leadership to take action, and does one or the other work?
That's a great question. So the question is about civility and decorum in the chambers, and what we have to kind of guide our behavior there. There are certainly rules. There's written rules about specific things. And otherwise it is up to the leader of the chamber to enforce that. So for example, in the House, it's the Speaker of the House, and in the Senate, it's the President of the Senate, who's the Lieutenant Governor. And some examples of that would be if someone were to make an accusation of another person during floor debate. Like if I were to say, Senator Corwin, she was a liar, and she did this terrible activity. In fact, it was bordering on, criminal behavior, and you're making like some terrible accusation or even name calling. Like we had, some instances of calling names. We even had someone use the F word one time. And so then the speaker will, hopefully knock their gavel, or the president of the Senate, and say, order, that's out of order. And sometimes an apology is required for that person. They might have to apologize directly to that person or do a public apology on the floor. And so sometimes that'll be enforced that way. But it's tough. I will say an example of when it wasn't enforced, and I think really gave North Dakota a black eye, was during the last legislative session. Senator Yana Murdahl, who I mentioned a moment ago, and another state senator turned their back on the faith leader who is doing the opening prayer. So every day when we have a floor session, the session opens with a prayer, and the faith leaders who deliver that prayer rotate, they take turns. And these two senators felt that the faith leader was including in her words of prayer things that they didn't agree with. And so they turned their back on this person during the prayer. And most people thought that was incredibly rude, but nothing was done about it that I'm aware of. So it's unfortunate. Patty?
How do you keep your spirits up and your hope for a better tomorrow?
Yoga breathing and wine. My husband's laughing. Other people, will help, so our caucus will get together like every Thursday night, and we get some pizza and we just sit in a room together and just relax together, and maybe share some stories about, here's one thing that went well for me this week, and just, try to lift each other up that way. Certainly, most people have the opportunity to go home every weekend. Not everyone can do that if they live a long ways away, but going home for the weekend and just connecting with, those of us from District 44 always say we have the best district because we can go home and we feel supported, right? The people in our districts, and it's that way with people from the other party too, they'll go home and hopefully they feel supported by their constituents, and their neighbors will say, thank you for serving, and I like what you did this week. And that makes you, get a little boost to do it again the next week, or, spend a little quiet time with your family and your dogs and things like that. So that's a few ways people do it.
So I wanted to, this is your approach is creating personal connections to do that. So I'll give you a little stories with this one. I'm from Western New York. I grew up Republican, Western New York Republican. And one time the head of the Republican Party for my county had to deal with an issue. One of the members had been acting up, so he had the talk with them, which is basically saying, this is not who we are. What you're doing needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. So how does this fit into a civil conversation? Because part of a civil conversation is the expectation by your own kind. This is what you are supposed to do. So how do you build that? And I know that might be outside of your area, but how do you build it so that your community, the ones you identify with, say, this is how we do things?
Yeah, it's a wonderful point and question. So we do have training on the process of identifying and reporting on different levels of inappropriate behavior, leveling from, starting out as disrespectful kind of things to harassment to, as you move down the levels to, criminal behavior, and how you report that. So people in the legislature and people who work for the legislative branch, legislative council, and lobbyists and the public all are expected to follow, this kind of set of, expectations of behavior, and can report inappropriate behavior to a number of people who are designated to receive that information. So if you're uncomfortable with who you could report to, there's other people you can report to. So for example, if you feel like your own leader has harassed you, you could report to a different leader. And Some people have felt nervous about going that formal route because they worry about repercussions or, blowback on them. They don't want their name to be public, and then that kind of makes them look like a complainer or something like that. And so we've tried to improve the process every time we meet to make sure, because we learn. Unfortunately, there's opportunities for us to learn on how to, I say that unfortunately, because that means, something happened that caused us to go through that process and see where there was bottlenecks or sticking points or places where people were reluctant to engage in it. So we want that process to be available to people, and we want people to feel comfortable to report that, someone was making an inappropriate joke and it was making me uncomfortable, or someone made a pass at me, or someone is threatening sort of quid pro quo, like a lobbyist and a legislator, and say, well, I'll vote for this if you, do this for me. And so, all inappropriate at different levels, but we want people to feel comfortable reporting that. And sometimes all people want is just for the behavior to stop. It's not necessarily that they want some kind of sanctions or someone like Representative Simons to be expelled. That was certainly an extreme example because there was a long history of very terrible behavior. But most of the time people just want the behavior to stop, and maybe an apology, and then let's move on, and so we're trying to improve on how we deal with that. But hopefully the leaders of the House and the Senate and the leaders of each caucus are setting a culture to where they're setting an expectation of this is how we behave together. This is how we treat other people with respect, whether it be in a committee room or on the floor or, out when we do our public forums or anything. So.
I guess I had a question about related to etiquette. I used to be in the military, and we would always get this social media talk, don't air grievances, don't do any type of airing, dirty laundry, that type of thing. Anything you say has a reflection on you, your career, everything else with that. How does social media, are there any restrictions? Everyone has, their own right to the platform, but is there any guidance, policy for legislators?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is about what kind of guidance legislators have on social media. And I would say really there is none, and there really should be. I think we're behind the times and what kind of guidance we might want to provide people, or at least advice, right? So I'd say, a lot of legislators, if they are involved in social media, not everyone is, might have like a personal presence and then a more of a professional presence. Like this is my legislative page or legislative X handle, or, Blue Sky or Threads or, YouTube, whatever, there's so many now. One thing that our caucus tells our members is whatever you write, whether it be your own post or a comment on someone else's post or on a news article, whatever, could end up as a headline. So be careful of what you write, because the headline could be, Representative Hanson says, Dennis, your sweater is just lovely, or something like that. So, or something, terrible. And there's certainly been examples of that in North Dakota, from all parties. And so you want to be careful about what you write, because it could be not just a reflection on you as a person and the group you're representing, but it could literally end up as a headline. And so we try to tell people to be very thoughtful about that. But there is no guidance otherwise. Yeah.
So two of these are my students. I wonder if they remember fallibilism that I try to teach it. They're in ethics, engineering, technology, which is a professional ethics class.
So fascinating.
Do you remember it or pretend that you do?
Getting put on the spot right now, my mind's kind of blank.
I can't remember.
Approaching every situation with an open mind, meaning you're not always right.
It's the idea that you could be wrong no matter, in any situation, no matter how strongly you hold a belief, because that opens you up to learning about others. So when you were talking about learn why, that is the, so fallibilism, that I can be wrong, I want to learn from you. And I think that's the best approach to have. But there our people aren't there who just don't want to learn.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that?
Yeah, I think learn where, so the question for everyone is, what do you do with people who just don't want to have an open mind or learn more about your establish a relationship? And I would say, you have limited time, you have limited energy, focus that time and energy on the relationships where you can make a difference. I have 140 colleagues. There's 141 legislators. I'm going to have more luck developing a strong relationship with some more than others. Additionally, there's people in the the executive branch, people who work in agencies of state government. There's lobbyists, there's stakeholders in our community. For example, if I have a bill on criminal justice reform, I will want to develop relationships with prosecutors and defense attorneys and judges and the police chiefs, et cetera. And so there's a lot of different people that we as lawmakers have to engage with. And you can't have a fantastic relationship with everyone. It would just be impossible because there's just not enough time to get to know everyone at that deep level. But if you think about what are your priorities as a lawmaker, like your bills or your committees, and who are the people that are important in my work on that, and maybe focus on that. And then if there's still some people there that are maybe more difficult than others, and then you focus on the majority, because all you need is 50% plus one to get a bill passed in most cases. I mean, not every case. So yeah, that would say that.
So I'll ask one more question. What items are going to be going to the legislature that will need civil conversations? Okay, just to give us a sort of preview.
Sure. So I think the big topics in the upcoming legislative session will certainly be, number one, property tax reform and property tax relief. As you know, Measure 4 was defeated in the November election, but we still recognize that people are really frustrated with their property taxes. So there's going to be a lot of conversations about the best way to approach property tax relief, giving money either as a primary residence check, you get $500 like you did this year, or homestead tax credit, or is there property tax reform, which just changes how we do things. Some of the ideas around there are things like putting limits on the local political subdivisions, like cities, counties, school boards, park boards, the ones who assess the mills and assess the value of your homes, changing how they're able to do those things. Maybe putting caps on their mill opportunities or caps on their spending. I have concern about that because, as they say, we like to say we're in favor of local control, but in cases like this, it's more about how do we control the locals. So I think we need a little bit more to allow more flexibility at that. So there's already 55 bills on property tax reform, 55. So hopefully that gets narrowed down, but that'll be a big one. And then some of the other things revolve around workforce. North Dakota has a lot of open jobs. So how do we attract people? How do we recruit people to all those open jobs? And then how do we address the barriers people have, both coming into the state or just moving around the state, with affordable housing and affordable and accessible childcare? Because you can't take a job if there's nowhere for your kid to be during the day, if there's not a safe place for your kid, or there's no house. If you're moving to Kindred and you're like, literally, there is nowhere for me to own or rent in Kindred, North Dakota, or Crosby or Rugby, wherever it might be. So I think addressing childcare and housing will be a couple other big rocks, and then healthcare, especially thinking about what happens from the federal level down to North Dakota. So if there's changes at the federal level, a huge percentage of our budget is public provided healthcare, Medicaid and Medicare. And so if there's changes at that level, or even with the private health insurance market with the Affordable Care Act, that can really change how we do things, even just within state government. That on an ongoing basis with healthcare, we always like to think about how do we keep our rural hospitals open, because we want to make sure that everyone has access to healthcare. And then behavioral healthcare, which includes addiction and mental health healthcare, are also top of mind considerations, because it's we've done a lot to improve in that area over the last 5 or 6 years, but at the same time, the need has also increased. So we've done a lot, but we're just keeping up with the growing need as well. So there's a lot of kind of big rocks in the upcoming legislative session.
Well, let's thank our speaker for a really useful, helpful discussion of how to have civil conversations.
Yep.
Thank you.